A chilling message echoed through the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace. "It's too late to fix this." The voice was not from an advisor, but the harsh truth Queen Camilla must now face. In a moment when power and influence seemed firmly in her hands, she suddenly realized that all her efforts to conceal, all her careful maneuvers, were now nothing more than irreparable fragments. According to insider sources, this was not a mere accident or an ordinary argument, a relentless series of events. Camilla's long-standing actions and decisions have culminated in a catastrophic picture. From behind-the-scenes scheming, subtle conflicts with other royal members, to confronting the legacy and memory of Princess Diana, all of this has now piled up into a crisis that even a seemingly strong queen like Camilla cannot resolve with power or wealth. The palace is buzzing with whispers and scrutinizing glances. Longtime advisors note that this is an unprecedented turning point. For the first time, Camilla must face the reality that, even as the king's wife, even with influence, she cannot undo the consequences of past missteps and exposed schemes. But what exactly led to this chilling declaration? Has Camilla gone too far in her pursuit of power, or is this simply the inevitable result of years of poor choices? Before we dive deeper into the story, I want to ask you, do you think Camilla still has a chance to reclaim her power and honour? Or is it truly too late? Leave a comment. Press 1 if you think there's still hope, or 2 if you believe it's already too late. When the rain began to fall, it came softly at first, thin drops tracing silver lines against the palace windows. Then, as if the sky could no longer hold back its sorrow, it began to pour. London lay under a grey blanket of clouds, and the grand gates of Kensington Palace stood tightly shut. Not a sound came from the streets outside. Even the air seemed heavy, as though it too understood that something inside those walls had gone terribly wrong. Within the palace, silence became a language. The soft clicking of shoes on marble floors, the hurried whispers between staff members, and the faint rustle of uniforms carried a strange unease. Usually, mornings at the palace began with gentle chatter, the scent of flowers from the courtyard, and the echo of laughter from distant rooms. But not today. Today, the palace was still. A young maid holding a tray of untouched tea froze as she noticed 2 senior aides walking quickly down the corridor. Their faces were pale, their voices hushed. She could not make out the words, but she saw their hands trembling. Something had happened, something that words struggled to carry. Behind closed doors, phones rang and stopped unanswered. Messages were passed quietly from one room to another. Every whisper deepened the tension, and every silence carried 1,000 fears. In her private sitting room, Kate Middleton sat near the window, watching the rain trace its path down the glass. The morning light was dim, turning her reflection into a blur. She had always found calm in the rain. But today, even its rhythm felt strange, like a warning. Her tea had gone cold. A book lay open beside her, unread. The air around her carried that strange stillness that often comes before tears. Then came the knock, soft, hesitant. "Your Royal Highness," a voice said quietly through the door. Kate turned, her heart tightening. Something in that tone, gentle yet trembling, made her chest ache before she even knew why. "Come in," she said, though her voice was barely a whisper. The door opened slowly, and her aide stepped in. His eyes did not meet hers at first. He held a small folder in his hands, pressed close to his chest, as though it were something sacred or something too heavy to hold. Kate rose from her chair, her expression calm but uncertain. "What is it?" she asked softly. The aide hesitated, searching for the right words, but there were none that could soften the blow of what he was about to say. Finally, he looked up. His lips trembled as he spoke. "It's very bad news, ma'am." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Kate's hands fell to her sides. She could hear the rain outside, but it sounded distant now, like it was coming from another world. "Who?" she asked. her voice breaking before she could stop it. The aide stepped closer, lowering his voice. What he said next filled the room with an unbearable stillness. Kate's face changed instantly. The grace that always surrounded her vanished, replaced by something raw. Shock, disbelief, and heartbreak all at once. Her breath caught and her eyes widened as if the truth itself had struck her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slowly. "That can't be true." But it was. The aide bowed his head, unable to meet her gaze. He murmured something else, perhaps an apology, perhaps a prayer, and then quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. Kate stood there, frozen. The silence pressed in from every side. Her chest ached with the kind of pain that steals words and breath all at once. The world outside went on. The rain fell. Cars moved far away. People hurried under umbrellas. But inside the palace, time stopped. She sat down slowly, her knees weak beneath her. Her eyes drifted to the window again. Though she no longer saw the rain, all she could see was memory. Moments came back to her. Laughter over morning tea, quiet conversations in the garden, shared glances during official events, faces, voices, and smiles that felt alive just yesterday now felt distant, fading into the echo of her thoughts. She pressed her hand to her lips as if to hold back the cry forming in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Not yet. Across the palace, life continued in whispers. The staff moved carefully, aware of the sorrow that had settled like fog in every corner. Curtains were drawn, phones were silenced. Kate rose again, her body moving on instinct. Her heels made no sound on the carpet as she stepped out into the hallway. The corridors stretched before her, long, golden, and empty. Every portrait, every vase, every polished surface seemed to watch her as she passed. She walked past the drawing room where laughter once echoed, past the dining room where candles once glowed during quiet family dinners, past the staircase where her children used to run, their laughter bright as sunlight. Now there was only silence. Each room she passed carried a ghost of sound, a faint trace of memory. She could almost hear the soft voice that would greet her every morning, and could almost feel the warmth of that presence that was now gone. The weight of it all settled deep in her chest. Her heart ached, not just for the loss, but for the love that would no longer be returned. The conversations that would never be finished. The comfort that could never again be felt. She paused by a large window overlooking the gardens. The roses glistened under the rain, their petals bending beneath the weight of water. They looked like they too were weeping. Kate pressed her hand against the cold glass and closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she remembered laughter in that garden. Soft voices, gentle teasing, shared smiles under summer skies. But those days were gone now. The ache in her chest deepened. She drew in a shaky breath and let it out slowly. "Please," she whispered to no one. "Let this not be real." But the silence gave no answer. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 11. The sound echoed through the halls, sharp and final. It felt like the closing of a chapter she was not ready to end. She turned away from the window and began walking again, her steps slow and unsteady. As she reached the grand hallway leading to the main staircase, she stopped. The place felt colder now, almost foreign. Every step, every breath, every memory was drenched in sorrow. She could feel the weight of the crown, not on her head, but on her heart, the burden of being strong when every part of her wanted to crumble. The staff bowed their heads when she passed. No one spoke. They did not need to. Their eyes said it all. The shared pain, the shared loss. By the time she reached the end of the hall, Kate paused once more. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly, straightening her shoulders, though her heart was breaking. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and unending. The city beyond the palace walls carried on, unaware that inside those gates, something precious had been lost. As Kate turned back toward her sitting room, she felt a strange stillness settle within her. Not acceptance, not yet, but a quiet understanding that life, as she knew it, had changed forever. She returned to her chair by the window. The rain had softened now, the storm easing into a gentle drizzle. She reached for the cup of tea she had left untouched and found it cold. She set it down again, her gaze lost in the grey sky. The world did not know yet. The palace had not spoken. The news had not been released. But within those walls, hearts were already in mourning. Kate clasped her hands together, staring out into the fading daylight. Her reflection looked back at her, composed, graceful, but with eyes that held too much pain. "The palace is in mourning," she whispered at last, her voice trembling in the quiet room. The heart that must not break. The morning light crept gently through the curtains, brushing against the soft cream walls of the palace nursery. The air was quiet. Too quiet for a home that usually carried the bright laughter of 3 young voices. Kate sat at the edge of her bed, her hands folded tightly together. Her eyes were swollen from the night before, but her expression was calm. She had spent hours awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the clock. Now, as the world outside began to stir, she knew what she had to do. She had to be strong. She had to be a mother. The pain inside her chest was sharp, like something heavy pressing against her ribs. Her heart felt bruised, her thoughts still clouded with disbelief. But she couldn't allow the storm inside her to touch her children. They were too young to understand the weight of loss, too innocent to carry the sorrow she felt. She drew in a deep breath and rose from the bed. The room around her seemed unchanged. Flowers still bloomed in vases. Framed photographs still smiled from the walls, but everything felt different. Grief had a way of stealing colour from the world. She straightened her blouse, smoothed the creases on her skirt, and finally left the room. The corridor was silent, except for the faint hum of the morning staff downstairs. The palace always seemed colder after sorrow entered its walls. As she walked, her steps echoed softly, carrying her toward the sound of her children's voices. When she reached the door to the nursery, she paused. A lump rose in her throat. Behind that door were the 3 people who gave her strength, who filled her world with love. She had no idea how to tell them that something had changed forever. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself, then opened the door. The room was filled with soft light. Toys lay scattered across the floor. Tiny shoes lined neatly by the wall, and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air. Prince George sat by the window trying to finish a puzzle. Princess Charlotte hummed quietly to her doll, while little Prince Louis sat cross-legged, building towers with colourful blocks. When they saw her, their faces lit up. "Mummy!" Louis called, running toward her, his small arms wrapped around her legs, and she bent down to hold him. For a brief moment, she let herself smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice calm, though her throat ached. Charlotte looked up, noticing the quiet sadness in her mother's eyes. "Mummy, are you okay?" she asked. Kate hesitated. The words she had practiced in her mind vanished. She looked at each of them, George's growing awareness, Charlotte's gentle curiosity, Louis's innocence, and felt her heart break all over again. She gathered them around the sofa, her hands trembling slightly as she held them close. "My darlings," she began slowly, "there's something very sad I need to tell you." The room went still. Even Louis stopped fidgeting, his blue eyes wide and focused. Kate took another breath, her voice gentle but firm. Someone very special to us, someone we love very much, has gone to heaven. Charlotte frowned softly. Gone to heaven? She repeated, her voice small. Yes, my love, Kate whispered, her hand brushing Charlotte's hair back. They won't be coming back, but they will always be with us in our hearts. George looked down at his hands, quiet for a long moment. But why? Mummy, he asked finally. Why did they have to go? Kate's eyes glistened, but she blinked quickly, refusing to let her tears fall. Sometimes, she said carefully, God calls people home when it's their time. We don't always understand why, but we have to believe they are at peace now. Louis, too young to fully grasp the meaning, looked up in confusion. Can we see them soon? He asked softly. Kate pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly. Not right now, darling, she whispered, but one day, far away from now, we will. The three children sat quietly, the weight of her words slowly settling in. Charlotte leaned against her mother's shoulder, silent but thoughtful. George stared out the window, his young mind trying to make sense of loss for the first time. Kate sat between them, her arms wrapped around her little ones. Inside, her heart screamed. She wanted to cry, to collapse, to let the grief she had buried all night spill out. But she couldn't. Not now. She needed to be their safety when the world felt uncertain. She needed to be their calm when everything else was breaking. After a long moment, George whispered, Will everything be okay? Mummy? Kate kissed his forehead gently. Yes, my love, she said softly. It will be. We'll hold each other and we'll remember the good things. That's how we stay strong. Charlotte looked up, her voice trembling. Will you be sad forever? Kate smiled faintly, though her heart felt like glass. No, sweetheart. Sadness doesn't last forever. It just takes time to heal, but we'll get through this together. She brushed her fingers over each of their hands, memorizing the warmth of their little palms against hers. Their love, innocent and pure, gave her the courage she needed to keep breathing. When the children began to play again, she sat quietly watching them. Louis returned to his blocks. Charlotte hummed softly to her doll again, and George went back to his puzzle, but their voices were softer now, their laughter not as loud as before. Kate looked at them and felt a mixture of sorrow and pride. They didn't yet understand the depth of loss, but they understood enough to be gentle, to stay close, to sense that their mother needed them as much as they needed her. The morning passed slowly. The rain outside had eased, leaving a dull silver glow over the gardens. Occasionally, one of the children would run to her side for a hug, and she would hold them tightly, whispering little words of love, but every time she turned away, her eyes filled again. The ache in her chest would not leave. It pressed against her ribs, heavy and cold. Later, when the children grew tired and drifted off for a nap, Kate remained seated by the window, her gaze distant. The palace grounds were calm, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Somewhere a bird sang, its melody faint but hopeful. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Grief was still there, sharp as ever. But she felt something else begin to stir beneath it, a quiet strength, a resolve that came from love itself. She rose slowly and walked to the mirror once more. Her reflection stared back, calm, steady, and composed. The traces of tears were gone, replaced by something stronger. She knew there would be harder days ahead. She knew the pain would come in waves, sometimes when she least expected it. But she also knew she could not fall apart. Her children's laughter, their little hands, their trust, those were her reasons to keep going. As she turned away from the mirror and looked back at the sleeping room, she whispered softly to herself, her voice almost breaking. They must not see me break. The words lingered in the still air like a promise, and though her heart ached, she stood tall because that is what mothers do. Even in their darkest hour, they hold the world together with trembling hands and love that never fades. When the world wept with the palace, morning broke softly over London, but the light carried no warmth. The air was heavy, the streets strangely quiet. Only the faint hum of news vans and the murmur of voices filled the stillness outside Kensington Palace. The gates, black and cold, had become the heart of the world's sorrow. Beyond them, a sea of flowers began to bloom. Roses, lilies, daffodils, each laid carefully by trembling hands. Candles flickered even in daylight, and handwritten cards whispered words of love and sympathy. By sunrise, the world already knew. Television screens across continents carried the same headline in bold, sombre letters. The palace is in mourning. From London to New York, Sydney to Cape Town. It was the only story anyone could speak about. Anchors spoke in hushed tones. Social media overflowed with memories, prayers, and disbelief. Strangers who had never met the royal family found themselves crying in their homes, feeling as though they too had lost someone dear. Outside the palace, the crowd grew larger. Men removed their hats, women held handkerchiefs to their lips, and children clutched small bouquets. The gates became a wall of colour. Flowers upon flowers, pictures tucked between the iron bars, candles flickering in rows like stars fallen to earth. Some people stood silently, their heads bowed. Others whispered prayers. The air carried the sound of soft weeping. Reporters moved among them, careful with their words. Broadcasters transmitted into their home countries around the clock. Security was enormous. Cameras zoomed in on the flowers, the tears, the trembling notes that read, "We love you. You will be missed. Rest in peace." The image of grief spread everywhere. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was one of quiet heartbreak. Curtains were drawn, lights dimmed. The usual movement of staff had slowed to a careful hush. Every step, every whisper felt respectful, restrained. In one of the upper rooms, Kate stood behind a window, half hidden by the curtain's edge. From there, she could see everything. The crowds, the flowers, the candles glowing faintly in the morning mist. She pressed a hand to the glass, her reflection faint against the pale light. For a long time, she said nothing. She simply watched, her heart aching at the sight of so much love. The faces outside did not know her personally, yet they stood there in the rain, mourning with her, sharing her pain in silence. It touched her deeply. But it also overwhelmed her. Fame had placed her life in front of the world, but it had never protected her from sorrow. If anything, it had only made her pain visible to millions. She thought of the flashing cameras waiting for her first appearance since the tragedy, of the endless stories already being written, of the voices speculating about what had happened and how she must be feeling. She wished for just a moment that she could be unseen, just a woman grieving quietly in her own home, away from the weight of titles and expectations. Behind her, a faint knock came at the door. "Your Royal Highness," a soft voice said. The crowds have grown larger. The press is asking for a statement. Kate did not turn immediately. Her eyes stayed on the people outside. "Not yet," she said finally. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Not today." When the aide left, the silence returned. She walked slowly to a nearby table where a small framed photograph rested, one she had placed there the night before. Her fingers brushed against the glass. The face in the photo smiled back at her, full of life and warmth. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, letting the tears come. They fell softly, soundlessly. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and roses through the open cracks of the old palace window. In the city, churches began to ring their bells. The sound travelled through the streets, reaching the palace gates where people bowed their heads in unison. Across the nation, flags were lowered to half-mast. Radio stations replaced their usual morning shows with quiet instrumentals, and newscasters spoke with voices that trembled. "The world mourns with the royal family," one anchor said on live television, her voice breaking slightly. "It is a day of sorrow across the United Kingdom and beyond." Kate heard the words faintly from a nearby television, but she did not look. She did not need to. She could feel the weight of the world's grief pressing through the walls. She turned once more to the window. The sight of strangers standing together brought both comfort and sadness. They were united in love. Yet they would never truly know the depth of what she had lost. They saw her as a symbol, graceful, composed, untouchable. But behind that image was a woman barely holding herself together. For years, she had learned to live under the gaze of millions. She had smiled when tired, waved when weary, and stood tall even when her heart was heavy. But now, that discipline felt harder to hold. Still, she would not break. The day wore on, and the skies darkened once more. Candles glowed brighter against the grey, the flames swaying gently in the wind. Reporters spoke of how people were coming from every corner of the country, young, old, strangers, and families, each leaving something behind at the gates. By evening, the palace gardens were covered in blossoms. The scent of flowers filled the air, blending with candle smoke and rain. Someone began to sing softly, a hymn that others soon joined. Their voices rose like a prayer over the palace walls, carried upward into the darkening sky. Inside, Kate listened. The melody was faint, but clear enough to reach her heart. She closed her eyes again, and this time the tears came freely. She thought of how fragile life truly was, how everything could change in a single breath. All the wealth, the honour, the fame, none of it mattered now. Grief made everyone equal. Sorrow stripped away the titles. In the distance, she turned from the window and sank into a chair. Her gaze lingered on the flicker of a candle someone had placed nearby. Its flame trembled, fighting against the draught of the room. Yet, it did not go out. That small light reminded her of something, the quiet resilience of love, the way it endured even through loss. She breathed deeply, steadying herself. Tomorrow she knew she would have to step out, face the cameras, the crowd, the endless questions. Tomorrow she would have to smile through the storm to thank the world for its kindness, even as her heart remained heavy. But tonight she allowed herself this moment of stillness, this quiet grief. Outside, a young girl pressed a letter through the gate, the words written in a child's uneven hand. "We are so sorry, Princess. We love you." The letter fluttered in the wind before catching against the iron bars. From her window, Kate saw it and placed her hand once more upon the glass. "Thank you," she whispered softly, though no one could hear her. Echoes of a gentle heart. The day of mourning arrived with a sky the colour of sorrow. London seemed to breathe differently. Heavy, slow, almost afraid to move. The rain that had begun at dawn had not stopped, falling softly over the black umbrellas lining the streets outside the palace. Flowers covered the gates like a sea of colour drowning in grey. Candles flickered in the wind, and their tiny flames mirrored the grief that had settled across the nation. The bells of Westminster Abbey tolled in long, aching intervals, each sound echoing through the hearts of those who had loved the one now gone. Inside the palace, the air felt colder than the rain outside. The corridors, once filled with laughter and the soft rhythm of daily life, were now quiet. Too quiet. Kate walked through them with slow steps, her hand brushing the edges of framed portraits on the wall. Every picture seemed to speak, reminding her of moments that now existed only in memory. Her reflection followed her in the polished glass, pale and still. Are you ready, Ma'am? A gentle voice asked behind her. It was one of her aides, speaking with care, as though words themselves might shatter the fragile calm she carried. Kate nodded softly, but said nothing. She was not sure anyone could ever be ready for such a day. As she made her way toward the waiting car, her thoughts drifted, pulled backward by memories that refused to fade. They came to her like soft waves, carrying with them the scent of summers past, the sound of laughter, and the warmth of someone she had loved dearly. She remembered the garden afternoons where gentle voices shared secrets no one else would ever hear. Do not lose yourself, they had once told her, handing her a small white flower. The world will ask for pieces of you every day. Keep something for yourself. Those words now returned to her like a whisper carried by the wind. As the car pulled away from the palace, she watched the familiar gates disappear behind her. Crowds bowed their heads as her car passed, their silence deeper than any sound. Some held pictures, others wiped tears. The world was mourning, but none more deeply than the woman who sat quietly behind the tinted glass, her hands clasped in her lap, at Westminster Abbey. The grand doors stood open, welcoming the sea of black that poured in. The scent of lilies filled the air. The choir sang softly, their voices rising like prayers made of light. Every note seemed to touch the very walls of the cathedral, trembling with emotion. Kate walked beside William, her steps slow and graceful, her eyes fixed on the coffin ahead. Simple, elegant, covered in white roses. She could not look away. Her heart tightened as she remembered the laughter they once shared during late-night talks in the palace drawing room. How the sound of their joy had filled the space like music. There had been moments of comfort, too, when the world felt too heavy, when criticism from the outside grew cruel. That same person had always been there, reminding her that kindness was stronger than judgment, that grace could outshine gossip. Now that voice was gone. The service began, but time seemed to lose meaning. Words from the clergy echoed softly, yet Kate barely heard them. Her eyes were drawn to the candlelight dancing beside the coffin, to the way the flames bent gently with the air. It reminded her of fragility, the delicate balance between life and what comes after. Around her, the royal family stood united in their grief. William's hand brushed hers briefly, a quiet sign of strength. The king bowed his head deeply, and Camilla's eyes shimmered with tears. The whole chapel seemed wrapped in sorrow, yet within it there was also peace, an unspoken understanding that love, though silenced, would never truly end. Kate's mind wandered once more to the past. She remembered a letter, their last exchange. It had been written in elegant looping handwriting, folded neatly and sealed with care. She had read it so many times that she could recite the final line by heart. When the world grows dark, find your light in kindness. That is where I will always be. Those words echoed inside her as the choir sang the final hymn. Her eyes filled with tears she had long held back, and this time she did not stop them. They fell quietly, one by one, landing on her clasped hands. The coffin was carried out. The slow steps of the pallbearers were measured and solemn. Outside, the sound of the rain mixed with the quiet sobs of the crowd. The bells tolled again, deep and mournful. Kate stood still, the cold wind brushing against her face. She wanted to speak, to whisper something to the one who was leaving her sight forever, but she could not find the words. Instead, she pressed a small silver locket to her chest, a keepsake that had once belonged to them. Inside it was a photograph, faded and warm with age. It showed a moment no one else had ever seen, two smiles free from duty, bathed in sunlight. That was how she wanted to remember them, not as loss, but as love. Love that had shaped her, strengthened her, and taught her the quiet power of compassion. As the final notes of the hymn faded, the coffin was lowered. The world seemed to hold its breath. Kate's lips moved silently. She whispered a goodbye that no one else could hear, a farewell carried only by the wind. Then, for a moment, she lifted her eyes toward the grey sky. The clouds had begun to part, and through them a single ray of light broke through. It touched the white roses resting on the coffin, turning them golden. Kate's tears glimmered as she watched. Perhaps she thought it was their way of saying goodbye. The ceremony ended, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of remembrance. As she walked back toward the car, her steps felt lighter than before. She knew that grief would linger, but so would love. It lived in every memory, every kind word, every gentle touch they had shared. That evening, back inside the palace, Kate placed the silver locket on her bedside table. She sat by the window, watching the lights of London shimmer below. For the first time in days, she smiled. A small, tender smile. "They are still with me," she whispered softly to herself. The garden of quiet healing. Weeks passed and slowly Kensington Palace began to breathe again. The heavy stillness that once filled its halls softened, replaced by gentle sounds, the rustle of leaves, the laughter of children, the soft footsteps of hope returning. The world outside had moved on, but inside those palace walls, healing was taking root in its own quiet way. Each morning, Kate found herself drawn to the garden. It had become her sanctuary, her space to think, to remember, and to mend. The roses were beginning to bloom again, their petals bright against the soft green leaves. She would walk among them with calm steps, her fingers grazing the dew that glistened in the early light. Here she could breathe without the weight of titles or duty. Here she was, simply Kate, a woman learning to live with love and loss entwined. She often carried a small leather journal, its pages now filled with thoughts too tender to speak aloud. Sitting on the old stone bench beneath the oak tree, she wrote of everything her heart could not hold in silence. "Grief is not an end," she once wrote. "It is love, searching for a place to rest." The act of writing became her quiet prayer, her way of finding peace between the pages of pain. Sometimes William joined her. He would sit beside her, their shoulders touching lightly. No words exchanged. They didn't need to speak. Their silence spoke of shared sorrow and quiet strength. The tragedy had changed them both, but it had also drawn them closer, binding them in ways only love tested by loss could. In the afternoons, Kate turned her heart toward her children. She knew they watched her closely, learning from every gesture, every word. She wanted them to understand that even in sadness, there could be beauty. She knelt with them in the garden, planting tiny seeds in the soil. "We'll watch them grow together," she told them softly, "just like hearts do after they've been hurt." Their laughter returned first, small, bright bursts that carried through the palace corridors. It was the sound that reminded her life would go on, even when it felt impossible. Each evening, when the children were asleep, Kate would pause by their doors, her eyes lingering on their peaceful faces. The pain was still there, but so was gratitude. She had learned that grief could live alongside love, and both could make her stronger. Sometimes she stood by the window, watching the sun dip behind the London skyline. The light that poured through the clouds looked like a gentle promise. She smiled faintly, pressing her palm to the cool glass, remembering every warm word, every kind touch, every memory she had been given. The palace still carried the weight of loss, but it no longer felt haunted. Flowers filled the halls again, and laughter returned to the air. The echoes of sorrow had softened into something tender, something almost sacred. And as Kate closed her journal one quiet evening, her heart whispered the truth she had come to know so deeply. The palace may have mourned, but from its tears, love still blooms. The letter beneath the light. The afternoon sun had begun to sink behind the grey rooftops of London. casting a soft golden glow over Kensington Palace. The air was still, touched by that tender kind of quiet that only comes at the end of a long day. Inside the palace, the halls were calm once more. No rush of footsteps, no whispered sorrow, only peace, fragile but real. Kate sat alone in her sitting room, the same room where her world had once fallen apart. The fire beside her burned gently, its flames dancing like small memories made of light. The grief that had once consumed her had softened with time, becoming something gentler, something she could live beside. But that evening, as she reached into an old wooden chest to tidy away a few things, her fingers brushed against a sealed envelope. Her heart stilled. It was old, yellowed slightly at the edges, and on the front, written in familiar handwriting, were her initials, C and K. The sight of it made her breath catch. The handwriting belonged to the one she had lost. The person who had meant more to her than words could ever say. For a long moment she simply stared at it, unable to move. The sound of the rain outside filled the silence, and the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel seemed louder than usual. Finally, with trembling hands, she broke the seal. The letter unfolded like a whisper from the past. The paper was worn, but the ink was steady, each word written with care and love. As her eyes moved over the page, she could almost hear their voice again, calm and gentle, speaking to her from somewhere beyond the ache of time. If you are reading this, it means life has carried me where you cannot follow. Do not let sorrow take what joy gave you. Remember faith in moments of darkness and family in the hours when you feel alone. And above all, have courage, the kind that blooms quietly in your heart when the world feels too heavy. Kate's vision blurred, her fingers pressed lightly against the paper, as though touching it could bring them back, even for a moment. You have a strength the world sees, but does not understand. The letter continued. You give light even when your own heart trembles. Never lose that. Her tears came slowly, softly, falling onto the page like rain upon glass. She read every word again, her lips parting in a trembling smile. It was as if they had known exactly what she would need to hear when this day arrived. It wasn't a farewell. It was a reminder, a gift left behind, not to reopen her pain, but to help her find her way through it. She looked around the room, the quiet fireplace, the soft curtains, the golden light spilling across the floor. Everything felt different now. The palace, once heavy with sorrow, seemed to breathe with life again. Setting the letter gently on her lap, she whispered to herself, "You knew I would need this." Outside, the sound of children's laughter floated faintly through the windows. Her heart ached and healed all at once. She could picture them playing in the gardens, their voices a melody of innocence and hope. The same gardens where she had once walked in tears now shimmered under the evening sun. Kate rose from her seat and moved toward the window. She held the letter close as she looked out at the view, the palace grounds glowing in warm light, the roses swaying in the wind, and the sky slowly deepening into shades of gold and amber. The world seemed to whisper around her, gentle and kind. She thought of everything they had shared, the laughter, the lessons, the quiet moments that had shaped her heart. It no longer hurt to remember. Instead, she felt grateful. Grateful that she had known such love. Grateful that it had left behind something beautiful enough to last forever. She pressed her hand to the glass, watching the light stretch across the gardens. "You're still with me," she said softly, her voice barely above a breath, and in that moment, it felt true. The warmth in the room grew brighter, the fading sunlight wrapping her in its glow. The letter still in her hands seemed to shine faintly, as though carrying the spirit of the words written within it. Kate placed it carefully inside her journal between the pages she had filled with her own reflections. It belonged there, among her thoughts and hopes, a bridge between what was lost and what remained. When William entered the room later, he found her standing by the window, the golden light touching her face. She turned to him with a calm smile, one that carried both sorrow and peace. He didn't need to ask what she had found. Her eyes said everything. He took her hand, and together they stood there for a while, watching the sky fade from gold to soft blue. The palace below them, once wrapped in mourning, now seemed alive again, a place of memory, love, and quiet strength. As dusk settled, Kate whispered one last time, more to herself than to anyone else. "Thank you for reminding me." Then she looked up at the sky where the first star had appeared, small, bright, and unwavering. It reminded her that even in darkness, light endures. The evening passed softly. The palace was silent, but it was no longer a silence of loss. It was a silence filled with peace, filled with love that lingered like the scent of roses in the night air. Down in the gardens, the wind stirred the flowers and the golden petals shimmered in the fading sun. Thank you for watching today's video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any investigative stories and untold secrets about the British royal family in our upcoming videos.